Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to Hollywood Backlot with Lou and you. We are so excited to bring this show to you once again right here. I know we had some trouble last week right there getting the show out. Lou, the render didn't go through. I guess, you know what it is? It's your voice. It's what you bring. Computer couldn't handle it. Yeah.
I'm a renderer from way back, in that other sense, so can't blame me. But maybe here's the thing. I'm so glad you said ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and didn't add and children of all ages, because I might have gone off the scale on that one. So
does that bring up some memories there for you, Lou?
Memories I hope to make if I live that long, but I've already made a few, so let's share them.
I see. Okay. Well, that is no problem there. Now, we were talking about the sound design and sound production back in the last show right there.
Yeah, we both realized that you were expecting me to mention him, I was expecting you to mention him, and somehow he got left out. You will see, folks, on the credits of movies, something called Foley artists or Foley work, or just the name Foley. That is because the guy who got tagged with being the inventor of a lot of these effects, and particularly of what's called a Foley floor or a Foley pit, which is, you saw in some of the pictures that Vash had last time, I'm sure he'll put them up again now, there's a section of the floor in a Foley stage, as it's called, that's divided into 4 or more sections of the floor, and one has gravel, and one has dirt, and one has hardwood, and one has tile or some other substance. So when they're doing those replacements of footfalls, they can get the shoes, and they have different shoes soles right as far as the sound of what was there on the original shoot. So Jack Foley was the guy, and I think he was the Universal guy, if memory serves me. That's another name that you'll see and say, who the heck what's a Foley? Well, that's what it is. Now you know.
Gotcha. You learn about Foley pretty early on, or at least you did back when Universal Studios Hollywood.
They used to mention him on the tour, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
They used to mention him on the tour. They used to have the 3 rooms at the lower lot right there. That they used to take you through the not development, but production, post-production, all that. Mm-hmm. And you had the Foley room as well. So
and then I remember, of course, I spent one summer gripping at Universal. And on what we called the gang, which meant not during working hours so much as coming on afterwards and moving things around. And we were working for about a week outside the stage right across from the paint department at Universal. And so we got to know the spiel as the tour guides, the charming little ladies and men of the tour, drove by saying, and over on the right side, you can see our paint department, where we make new things look old and old things look new. Me and my 4 compatriots on the gang started saying it with her, loud. They were not amused. We would jump in as the Greek chorus, where we make new things look old and old things look new. And the people were amused, but, paint is paint.
I'm sure she got a kick out of that for sure.
She had to keep her little painted smile on. So she turned over to us with this painted smile, and you could see the teeth grinding underneath it as she got more and more annoyed every time she came by, this one in particular.
Oh, that's great.
But then I had a friend at USC who started her movie career as a tour guide at Universal, and she went on to be a very major production manager on some shows So there you go.
Well, hey.
Working your way up in the biz.
Yeah, everybody's Hollywood experience is a little bit different, so...
Yeah, they probably have some interesting questions for us, don't they? Slurp my delicious hot tea that's breaking up the phlegm. So if I sound a little grumble in the back of the throat today, folks, for whatever reason, maybe the pollen. So I'll try and kill it with the mute button when I can. Onwards.
You got it. The first one isn't necessarily a question, but I did want to address it right here. This is from Bonanza Road. I worked at Universal and got to know Lou. I want to bring this up just for the sake of, hey, if you did, please contact us somehow. Either use the email that we give out every single week right here, which is 23ponline@yahoo.com, or reach out in the comments, something, because we would love to get your experiences on the show.
Well, usually at this point, I forgot to saying what I will and won't answer, and I try to keep the confidences of individuals that I worked with private. And therefore, privately, if you would like to tell me what you did and how you got to know Lou, and how much of it you're willing to share or not, we will honor that request, absolutely. I don't know if anybody really got to know Lou. Lou was kind of a private guy in his own little way, but not as stern as most pictures, including the one I picked, make him seem, but kind of. Sort of, almost. Did you see they took his statue down at the studio in Orlando?
Whoa,
I didn't know it was there. I didn't know it was there, but somebody posted a picture of the old New York Street, the part of it that's left, and there's this round spot where it used to be. And I thought, is it something we, they said, Are
Oh,
they planning
no.
a monster-lit statue for somewhere else, like Walt over at Epcot? Hope not.
They're putting him in Epic Universe, Lou. That's what they're doing. At least we hope. We hope, for sure. Yeah, let's go ahead and get to the questions right here. Trooper Donnie asks, any stories about Boris Karloff?
Well, he was an interesting guy, William Henry Pratt. That was his real name. The only story really, nothing personally, and because he was before my time, is I don't know how many people know this. You can probably find the picture of the newspaper clipping. He was a wizard Mexican chef, and his recipe for guacamole, believe it or not, was syndicated all across the country in newspapers. Who would have thought that William Henry Pratt from England, who wound up becoming a famous monster, was a guacamole freak? But you could actually try his recipe. And as I remember, it has a dash of sherry in it, dry sherry, which is an interesting idea. The story, of course, that those of you who remember Batman, you'll know, of course, Frank Gorshin, who played the Riddler. And Gorshin, before that, was famous mostly as a comedian and especially as an impressionist. He did amazingly good impressions of all the famous stars. And I heard him interviewed one time, and they asked him, how do you get, it so right? And he said, I have found that there is usually one word, which may be utterly irrelevant to the person, but that which, if you say it just like that, it carries the whole impression and you get the hang of it. And the one he mentioned was Karloff. And the word, are you ready? Antipasto. To think about it with his English, get the antipasto, Francesca. We'll go to the town and try it on the fair. The antipasto, that little bit of lisp that he had, it works. So that's my strange Boris Karloff story. Although really it's more of a strange Frank Gorshin story. But try the guacamole. I'm sure it's delicious.
Oh, I definitely have to try it now. Always fascinating to go over whenever I learn on these shows right here. So thank you so much, Trooper Johnny, for that question right here. Got another one for you. What star is your absolute favorite to watch or have worked with?
How can I pick one? I had the extreme good fortune, as I was picky, of only working with mostly good people. There were one or two who were, not. But I was remarkably fortunate. And as I say, I would have been richer and famouser if I had taken all the offers I got. But a lot of them I said, no, I've heard things about that guy. I don't think I want to subject myself to that. So I'd rather not mention any particular person. But as far as watching, tune us in on the genre guys. We cover a lot of them there. And talk about how certain people can make a whole movie with their performance. Most recently, we just did the great Hitchcock Without Hitchcock movie, but with sense around, Roller Coaster. And George Segal and Richard Widmark have such fun making that movie something special. There's a couple of good examples right there.
Oh, that's so cool. That is fantastic right there.
And for that matter, tonight we are recording our next installment, which is Buckaroo Banzai, Across the Eighth Dimension. And I would say Peter Weller and Jeff Goldblum make that movie. And John Lithgow, of course, as Dr. Emilio Lizardo from Planet 10.
Oh, that is some interesting stuff right there. And folks, by the way, if you want to get early access to, or as early access as you can get to the genre guys, make sure you become a member at WW Pro's channel right there, and they will be over here after about 90 days. So
I was going to say, after mentioning it, if you want to know what the heck is that, we're starting to show them here once they sort of come off license, as you might say, on the other channel. So it'll give you a taste of what we do. We dive into a movie every week and explore it from up, down, sideways, and in between in ways that we hope are amusing, and so far receiving good response. So that's what that is.
Fantastic. Love it. Love the genre, guys. Love doing them, actually, for this channel. Next question from Northman JH2186 says, how did radio adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, like the Basil Rathbone series, create suspense and atmosphere without the use of visuals?
Well, first of all, on that show, because I know that show very well, I think the music really helped. They had some great, in radio, some of the music on the big, big, expensive shows was an actual orchestra. In some cases, they recorded a bunch of sort of stock music for that show that was orchestral, but mostly it was audio, either an organ or a piano or a small combo. And I would say the music for the atmosphere on Sherlock Holmes was awfully. Secondly, of course, everything we've said about sound effects. When you're Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson out there on the moors and the winds are blowing and the storms are, and the howl of the Hound of the Baskervilles is in the background, that helps. But it's mostly about performance, about these guys, words off the page, which were very good. There was a guy, I think his name was Anthony Boucher, who was the executive producer and wrote a lot of the scripts. Because, of course, they did, lots of them, years and years and years worth, and very quickly exhausted the original stories. The only other show I know that did that kind of thing, if you've seen the wonderful Poirot from the BBC with David Suchet, he made a point that they covered every single Hercule Poirot show that Agatha Christie ever wrote in the course of the, I guess, 7, 8, 9, 10 years that they did the show. But Sherlock Holmes, well, you have to remember that they made the movies relatively cheaply at Universal. They made a couple, and suddenly it took off. And for everybody of that generation and since, as great as some of the other interpretations have been, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, or Willie Bruce, as he's known to his friends, they are Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Now, interestingly, those shows were sponsored by a California wine company called Petri. And there was an announcer, Paul Bartel, I think his name was. And the beginning of every show was Bartel and Dr. Watson sitting around having a nice glass of Petri wine of whatever flavor they were pushing that week and saying, well, I remember the case where this week I'm going to tell you a fascinating story of. So it was all flashback for Dr. Watson, looking back on his many cases, like the books were allegedly written by him as a coverage of his friend's genius. So that show was pretty special. And I happen to know very closely one of the actresses who played a lot of different parts on the show. And she had a lot of fun with those people. They were a good group. They also did the show from military bases as kind of like like we see the Bob Hope USO stuff in latter day to entertain the troops. It was a great show, and certainly much more radio than even all the, I think there's 9, 10, 11 of those movies. I forget how many, frankly, you can look it up. But there's much more of the radio show than of anything.
Wow, that's
about
really
sound effects and understanding sound. And one more thing about sound. Of course, that Orson Welles was famously a radio star first, basically. And you might know that he was the original voice of the Shadow. And that he did all kinds of radio, including, by the way, the famous War of the Worlds broadcast, where people thought that it was really the Martians landing that we talked about the effects for last time. I'd forgotten until rewatching it. That broadcast plays a plot point in Buckaroo Banzai, by the way. Orson Welles is a non-present but important character in that movie. But Welles understood sound better than anybody in his own voice, where he would put in all these dramatic pauses that made you wonder what he was saying next. But also understanding how music and effects. Well, when I was a young budding film student, and my teacher was a former aide-de-camp research assistant for Marshall McLuhan, the famous guy who said, the medium is the message and all of that. He did a really wonderful experiment with us that you might want to try at home. Although doing it on your TV is a little more difficult than in those days, 16 millimeter Bell and Howell projectors, like we all knew from a certain age in school. He played Citizen Kane, the first couple of reels, with the projector lamp off, so that you experience this visually stunning Greg Toland photography and editing without any pictures, just the soundtrack. And you could suddenly realize how involving and how brilliant the use of sound is in that movie and many others. So try that sometime if you want to see what sound can do.
Ooh, that's a good idea right there. I'll have to try that out for sure, because Orson Welles, just phenomenal voice actor and obviously going over his sound effects expertise. But, he was the first in a line of many of those great radio artists. In fact, I can think of one in particular.
There's no turning back.
Paul Frees.
Yes, who I guess attempted to emulate Orson Welles in the later years, is that right?
Well, not so much later years. He did it as kind of that voice, indeed, as an Orson Welles-esque voice. But a lot of Paul's work was actually dubbing movies for real people. He did Peter Lorre, he did Orson Welles, he did lots of famous voices. In fact, for those of you out there who don't know, there was a wonderful comedy band leader named Spike Jones. And Spike Jones and his City Slickers. And they made a lot of comedy records based on movie themes and made a lot of monster ones where Paul Frees came in and did Peter Lorre-ish voices and other spooky voices. Spike Jones, you might also know, there was a guy named Doodles Weaver who did voices for him. But anyway, Paul Frees is on a lot of those. Paul Frees did commercials. Of course, he did famously not just the Disney voices we know of, but Boris Badenoch on Rocky and Bullwinkle, and the Pillsbury Doughboy were probably his two most famous voices, at least as far as many appearances are concerned. But Paul made a good living aside from his own work as an actor, imitating these other actors because they were busy on the set making the next movie and couldn't come back into the dubbing stage, or they were off on location. So they'd call Paul in to imitate them, and they're on the soundtrack. Also, there's a lot of Paul in his kind of basic all-American announcer voice on a lot of movies, like where you'll see the stars having a press conference in the movie, and you'll hear a question shouted from the back of the audience. That's Paul and a few other people that did that sort of thing. But he wound up buying an old ferry boat in Sausalito and living up there and putting in a studio. And he never came back to Hollywood, really, except for occasional. They would send him the script and he'd record it and send it back to them for whatever it was for all of the later years of his life.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I had no idea, but he's kind of like a session player almost, you know?
Yeah, exactly,
bring him in here.
Exactly. Well, there was a band. There's actually a pretty good documentary, I think it's on Amazon, called The Wrecking Crew, of Hollywood studio players who got together to do soundtracks and musical takes for things. Most people don't know that the trailer is often, it needs to get out before the actual score has been recorded. So they bring in people. I have a very good friend named John Deal who composes or did a lot of trailer things where they said, well, we're getting John Williams or whoever, and he's going to do, but meanwhile, we need something 30 seconds long for the trailer. And they'd call in these orchestras, do music that wasn't really going to be in the movie, but that was in the style of, and record it just to make the trailer so they could get out early and promote the movie.
Wow, that is really, really something. I had no idea that there's some great Paul Frees stuff. I think he also did, I want to say he did the 70s voiceover for, I think, The Beast, when that actually opened up.
Yeah,
I think King's Island. All kinds of stuff, but I know I'm best in the theme park realm, obviously doing the voiceover work for Great Moments of Mr. Lincoln. Obviously, the Haunted Mansion's probably his most famous work in the theme park realm for sure. But
Mr. Lincoln, the actual voice of Mr. Lincoln, of course, is an actor named Royal Dano, but who was in everything too. I mean, these guys, when they were good and they were reliable, they worked. And I always, when people say, how can my son, my daughter, my cousin wants to be an actor? I said, first of all, be reliable, be dependable, and you'll get hired based on that. Somebody during one of these various strikes over the years, or near strikes, estimated that out of the 150,000 or more members of the Screen Actors Guild, about 2,500 people make 90% of the money. And that's not just big stars. There aren't that many big stars. It's people who get called back again and again and again because they are reliable and show up on time and know their lines and hit their marks and do the job. Whether they're good, yeah, that helps. But if I have to take a chance on somebody versus somebody I know isn't going to let me down, especially for a 1 day, 2 day part, I'm going to go with the reliable person if I'm casting that thing, because time is money,
Oh yes, absolutely. I get it completely. Reliability. That's definitely has its own valuation for sure. No question there. Speaking of reliability, or maybe this is a terrible transition, but I'm going to try it anyway. Deborah Perry, 3056. Just watched a miniseries with a fairly large cast. I had a hard time keeping up with the characters and keeping them apart. Is that due to casting, directing, writing, acting, or is it just me?
I think it's a group effort. But I always tell aspiring writers, if you watch a movie and something isn't working, chances are the first thing is always the script. And what it is not story structure. It's the voice. And by that, I mean every character speaks in their own style with their own language. Even though they're all speaking English or whatever, everybody uses things a little differently. And when one writer doesn't get that, and he's got a great story to tell, but he's going to have everybody tell it, and they all sound exactly the same, sure, you blur your image of who's who and what's what. After that, all of those things could be part of it. Absolutely. Sometimes, it's also, if it's a miniseries for TV with a large cast, to some degree, for better or worse, that's a committee effort as far as the planning is concerned. And they'll have the script ready to go and it's pretty tight. And they'll say, well, you know what? Couldn't we add a scene with a guy who, maybe it's a car racing movie. Couldn't we add a sub-character who races horses and thinks cars are the work of the devil? Has nothing to do with the story, but what the hell? We need another 20 minutes to put it in. So when you start layering and layering and layering all of these semi-extraneous things, and then when you say the direction, it's how much attention do we pay to these things that are not integral to the major plot. If they're comedic, for example, the Genre Guys, and I think that one is now, it's on this channel, so you can watch it for free, as they say. Forbidden Planet is a serious, the first big studio science fiction movie ever. But because they decided it was a little too grim, perhaps, a little too scary, they added a character, crew members of the actor Earl Holliman, who is like a junior guy on the crew, but he's getting Robbie the robot to help him brew up some booze in the background, just as a gag, so they can all get drunk and miss the alien coming through the camp. Well, that works, but sometimes that stuff doesn't work. And even if you have especially maybe if you have a very good actor playing those extraneous parts, they pull so much attention with their performance that it makes you concentrate on somebody that's never going to pay off and never going to be part of the overall resolution of the story because they were never intended to be there in the first place. So a group effort, indeed, is the answer. And could it be you? Yeah, but probably not. And it probably didn't change the ratings or the reception of the show overall, except to space it out. We were talking about, on one of the other channels, I think it was, we were discussing all of these TV series now on streaming that are 8 or 10 episodes, as opposed to the old 23, 33, depending on the era of regular TV. And that those were, you had the situation comedy, okay? It means we've got a character set that we know, that we like, that we want to follow and see what happens to them next. And each week they encounter a new situation. Well, when you are telling a serial story that all connects to one plot line, basically, over 8 or 10 episodes, but you've only got enough plot line for 5 or 4, as I say, there's a whole lot of, everything's going along, and then suddenly we all stop and gaze at each other's navels and contemplate the meaning of life. And man, that's a drag. And that seems to me to be one of the worst things that happens, certainly with the Star Trek series and the Marvel series and everything else. But they got to fill out those 8 or 10, and they didn't have enough plot. And once again, it comes down to get a script that works first before you say action.
The creators of today, I talk about it often, and how they have limited life experience compared to the life experiences of the creators of before, right? Where they lived through multiple wars and big geopolitical conflicts and so forth that really shaped who they were. And so I think that also has something to do with, creating multivariate characters and so forth that really distinguish.
I totally
it can be
agree.
distinguished one from the other.
Not that I want a world war, but to make good theater.
Yeah, exactly.
But certainly, even if you consider people who were 5 or 10 years old during World War II, they didn't go to war. Maybe they didn't even have a relative who went to the war and actually was in danger. But the atmosphere around them, it was in the news, it was in the theater, it was on the radio, it was in what they did every day and what was rationed and what they couldn't do or travel to. People forget. I know a lot of people who, even if they're enthusiasts for classic cars, we stopped making them for 3 years, 4 years. People used to put their cars up on blocks, and God, did they treasure spare tires, because rubber was all going into the war effort. Well, all of that economic activity that gets altered and social activity that gets altered, and certainly in the day when you didn't have 150 channels of nothing to watch, what was on the radio channel on the news or what was in the newspaper, it affects you. It affects your worldview. You're absolutely right. And people have different experiences now. And if your worldview is playing video games in mom's basement until you're 25, and then suddenly you're going to write a story about love and whatever, chances are, not your fault, but you are somewhat handicapped in that department. So
I would absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. For sure. Right there. Definitely, get out, touch some grass, guys. Come on. There's a bright world out there for sure. I think is the modern.
Go to a theme park that doesn't keep your nose in your phone 24/7.
You see, that's tough to do nowadays. But I would recommend it for sure. Dollywood, maybe. Josh Hammond has a the longer question, so I'll go ahead and read it right here. Here's another question for you guys. Is it true that Hollywood makes entertainment for everyone, or do they generally have a specific audience in mind when making it? Or do the creators of said entertainment exclude specific members of the audience or fans when making it? I think nowadays people seem to conflate the line, it's for everyone, even though technically it's for a specific audience.
I would say, Josh, that's changed considerably over time. Once upon a time, it was for as many people as you can attract, old, young, whatever, even though you knew the action stuff was going to be more about guys and the romance stuff might be, but who knows, But now we came to an era of studying and understanding demographics and of selling commercials. And you come into the television era and you get this company called Nielsen startup, keeping track of who's watching literally originally by giving people a little notebook and telling them, we'll pay you if you will write down what you're watching when for the next month, and we'll come collect the notebook. And then it became devices that actually sent the signal back to home base and told them what was being watched. And now there are more scientific means. But you want to know who a show is being made for? Look at who's advertising. I always said I did a lot of pilots for new shows, then went on to start going and hope they would stick. Some did, some didn't. But when you were doing a new show, you knew you had arrived when the commercials started being, when you watched it, weeks and months later, for Coca-Cola or major car companies, or in the days when that was legal, the major cigarette companies, because they were looking to hit everybody, not just a niche market. And therefore, your show, if it was rating well, was getting more expensive, and only the big guys would pay for it. Now, in the days when Lou first started doing TV with MCA, and when they bought Universal to have a place to make it, the sponsors were the ones who put the show together before it even went to the networks. The network said, anybody who's got the money, show up with a show and we'll probably put you on the air. So cigarette companies obviously were not appealing to 12-year-olds. Maybe they didn't know it or couldn't admit it. But beer companies, in the days when you could advertise alcohol. So it's the cart and the horse as far as, are you making it for that audience, or is that audience finding it and therefore making it their own? And the answer is that the answer changes. But there are more desirable demographics, and that's about economies, not about art, in the sense that people who are younger have more disposable income, or actually people who are a little more than younger, very young. Remember, Walt always knew that as much as he was making something for the family and for kids, it was the parents and the grandparents who bought the tickets and bought the plushies and bought the Mickey Mouse watches. Kids don't have any money. They seem to have forgotten that nowadays, too, going after people who don't and never will have kids. But that's their choice. Anyway, the question is, do they have a more specific audience in mind because they want to aim at that audience? Or is it because I now have the science to back up that it's for that audience, and therefore I have a good excuse to my boss as to why we should do it? Remember that the primary motivation of almost all network executives and studio executives, other than the guy at the top, and even for him or her, is if it flops, what's my excuse? I don't want any flop to kill my career. So that is why also you will notice when studios change hands at the top, the first thing that happens is that the shows that are still out there in the pipeline and still about to come out, their ad and publicity budgets get cut like crazy. Because the new guy wants to prove you were right to fire that guy. See how rotten all the stuff he made was and how much money we lost on it? I know that sounds crass and cold, but that's about survival in the world of rivals. So anyway, that's more than what you asked, but there you go.
No, I think it's a great point. This is why I wanted to bring up this question, because we see this content and it's almost like it's attempting to appeal to a niche market, and it's like, okay, yeah, you can do that, but you're not going to be doing it with 4-quadrant budgets, that's for sure. And other things that should appeal to the widest base possible seemingly don't, and it's really fascinating to see how that evolves.
And one other thing is that it's gotten to the point. You said entertainment for everyone. The audience has become something that self-segregates itself in ways never envisioned before. Well, we don't watch that movie because it's got war in it or it's got whatever in it. We don't believe in those things. Not. It's got people going through a crisis just like any other. Happens to be that. Or, well, example, not from movies, but from marketing. I remember reading a story when they first came out, if anybody remembers, with the cigarette brand Virginia Slims. And it was aimed solely at women. The theme song was "You've Come a Long Way, Baby," and they had pictures of suffragettes. And this is, the one for you if you're a woman. And they asked the people, I forget whether it was RJR or which major tobacco company it was. They said, women only make up at that time 30% of all smokers. How come you're going after a minority? They said, because if we can get 100% or 30%, that's a whole hell of a lot of people. So to some degree, niche marketing makes sense if it's a big enough niche. And back when they could read the numbers and find it, that's one thing. But when the audience decides to segregate itself into all these subgroupings and cubbyholes, it gets harder to predict.
This is more of a contemporary question for you, Lou. So what do you think that the streaming area has had on all of this? Because streaming, they don't really release those numbers in the way that you could maybe find them as easily, like with Nielsen and so forth. Do you think that's affected anything? And maybe do you think that needs to change in terms of...
Well, I think they are now because they're trying to sell ads, and advertisers won't just take your word for it as to how many eyes and ears are watching and listening.
Gotcha.
So that's changed. The streaming originally was all about getting you to pay up every month. And in most cases, all cases in cable, you didn't, as much as they offered, would you like to just buy HBO or just buy Showtime? Usually they were bundles of various assortments of channels. And when that happened, suddenly you had HBO 1, 2, 3, 5, 12, and so they became their own bundle of channels. Why? Because if we have 5 and you only have 100, we've got 5 out of 100 instead of 1 out of 100, and each one is paying a little money into the kitty, whether you watch it or not. So it keeps evolving is the answer. And now with some of these conglomerations of channels joining up, it's kind of reverting back to the old original cable bundle days, only you're going to buy it directly from that entity rather than through your cable provider.
And now I'm realizing why that might be, regressing to that point right there. Now that makes a whole lot more sense. So thank you so much, Lou, for that.
It's not a regression as much as it is people who thought they had a better idea finding out, no, they didn't. It was actually a better idea before. We better go back.
Yes.
Surprise! Reinventing the wheel is a term, and you don't have to. It's been done.
Right. Oh, that is so true. Very, very true for sure. We got our next one right here from Anna Greco, 3280. Was the first Academy Awards presentation created in response to the introduction of the aerial camera work to film battle scenes in the movie Wings, filmed in 1927. None of the other films up for the nomination came even close to exhibiting advanced camera work like what was shown in Wings. What do you think here, Lou?
Well, it was the first winner of the Best Picture. And to give you an idea, the entire presentation was done in the ballroom at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. So it was a small gathering. There's some interesting photographs of those crowd scenes of the people attending. And suddenly you say, oh, look, there's Walt Disney. Oh, look, there's whoever. You'll probably find that picture. It's like a panorama of the ballroom with everybody in their tuxes getting ready to do the Oscars. You can actually visit that room. Go to Hollywood. They give tours of the hotel that are kind of interesting. And they have a cool little museum of Hollywood up on the second floor mezzanine. That hotel is about a block and a half away from the real Chinese theater, by the way. I don't know that was why that picture won. It was a very popular movie, but certainly those scenes that were filmed from real airplanes and in real flying that people, remember, 1927, you're roughly, 10 years after World War I, 12 years after World War I, and it was exciting. It was exciting stuff. So I don't know if you could say there's a cause and effect, but certainly it opened new doors. I mean, every technical advance opens creative doors. Just moving the camera on a dolly was a big deal because movies came out of stage. Stage was stationary. Therefore, you planted it and you shot it. And also to make it move without making noise, without bumping, without jiggling, was a thing that they had to practice to make perfect. I would suggest that as great as the aerial photography is, it was more a real innovation of editing, because you could have all those great shots, but if they didn't cut together and they didn't move the right way and they didn't join up as one integral scene, then it's a documentary. It's not a movie.
Yeah. I would agree with you actually there, and it's so profoundly interesting because you think about the films that were saved through editing, right? Like the original Star Wars, actually utilizing all the World War II footage in which to work off of or some of the assemblage of those scenes. So I think it's particularly fascinating for sure. In the context of the Academy Awards, though, I mean, what started that? I guess what was the genesis of it?
Well, I think certainly a certain amount was what you might call an inferiority complex. You can actually find pictures of hotels or restaurants with signs that say "No Irish, no actors." We were, the showbiz was a prejudice against class of people. In people's minds, they were the same as the shoddy carnival operators and the medicine snake oil salesman. So they wanted to give it a veneer of legitimacy, and it worked. And now, of course, the Academy, in case those of you who haven't seen the news, is actually having a charity fundraising drive to raise $500 million to keep the whole thing in business, because the ratings are so low on the TV coverage, because nobody gives a damn, because they've ruined it so much, that the sponsorship is not paying what it used to, because that was the primary financial support for the entire Academy. And the Academy, by the way, those who don't know, has a huge museum and keeps copies of classic movies and does a lot of other stuff to preserve the history of the business. So, but yeah, the Academy Awards we're going to put on our finery and show people we're legitimate, just like all those snobs who look down on us, I would say. They'll never admit it, but
yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because is it untrustworthiness? Is it trepidation? I don't know. People's thoughts about actors have kind of gone back to some of those old feelings, at least in certain parts of the country, where it's like, I don't necessarily trust actors. They have to do something to prove themselves in order to earn my respect or trust. So it's an interesting thing. How it's
all you have to do is look
time.
at Team America, for that whole attitude to be brought out in a funny way. And do look at it if you've never seen it or you haven't seen it lately. It only gets more relevant with time, not less, which is a damn shame, but that's the truth.
Oh, ain't that the truth? Oh, absolutely perfect, good sir. I think we're gonna do just one more right here. Chamber a question for next week for sure. This one is from Evangelical Mean 6929, if I got that right. Back in the late 1970s, early 80s, the concept of the blockbuster came about. But had there been any movies prior to that could be compared, and we just didn't have a name for it?
We had the movies. I would say that I don't know what the origin of the name is, to tell you the truth. I could look it up, and so can you, and we won't bore you with that. But we certainly had movies that were huge as far as their acceptance. Look at Gone with the Wind. Look at so many. What we didn't have was 4,500 screens to put them on. What we didn't have, remember, movies in the old days, most movies would open in New York and LA and San Francisco and Chicago and maybe one or two other places for a week or two before they went everywhere else, which was partly because, well, we want to get the audience where there's enough bodies to fill the theater every time. But it was also a question of how much is the studio going to commit to making more prints. So there was a financial reason for that, too. So you had big movies. You had huge movies. You just didn't have them opening day and date all across the country in every little nook and cranny. So that's what you're talking about as far as that 70s, 80s era of, Jaws and the disaster movies. And of course, blockbuster's a great word, right? It's good for an ad. The latest blockbuster from, so people get tired of saying hit. Blockbuster's got more syllables, so the announcer can push it more in the TV commercial. And that's the other thing. You had television as a means of advertising all across the country. As newspapers faded and TV and online grew, it shifted. But in the old days, you had a couple of big chains of movie theaters. You had Hearst and Scripps and a few others. And if you got on their wrong side, as unfortunately Orsen discovered, that was a problem. And we have to remember that all of the Hollywood gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons and their ilk, they worked for the newspaper. And therefore, if the owner of the newspaper didn't like somebody, all the great performances in the world weren't going to get you a positive review from those people. And people paid attention to them. Because, again, you have to go from the mentality of today, which is I've got 4 million possibilities when I turn on a screen of what to watch, versus 1 or 2 or 3 in your town. I've already mentioned, I think, but I will again, that people don't realize why did ABC pay for Disneyland? And in case you didn't know, they did. And the reason is, once upon a time, there was NBC and there was CBS, and that was about it. There were other smaller networks, Mutual and that came out of radio, but those were the two big ones. And in fact, NBC was so big, and the rules allowed it then and then didn't later, that they sometimes had two stations in the same city. And so NBC had two entire networks of both radio and television, and they were called the Red Network and the Blue Network. I guess white was probably the one they wouldn't use even then. So, but what's funny, there's a radio blooper out there. You got to look for it like crazy to find it, where an announcer at 2 a.m. at Rockefeller Center in New York is not sure which network he's on of the two. And he comes on and he says, with the station ID, he said, "This is either the Red Network or the Blue Network of the National Broadcasting Company." So when you had that, what happened was that after the war, when the government was getting more activist about antitrust, saying you can't have a monopoly, if you had the two biggest stations in town, obviously nobody could come close. And you had the ability to set advertising rates and to blacklist other companies if you didn't like them. So the government stepped in and they said, NBC, no. We're going to change the rules and say that you cannot have two affiliates or two O&Os, as they called it, owned and operated, in the same place. You have to spin off. Well, if they're going to spin off a station, which one are they going to spin off? The weaker one. And that new network of the spun off, scorned, lesser NBC stations and a few others became ABC. And ABC was always the poor stepchild of the family of networks, and they needed something. Now, Hollywood wanted nothing to do with television because they basically said, well, wait a minute. You mean they can watch stuff for free at home and not go out and buy a ticket to our movies? Right. That's no good. That's no good. Later, when what they called pay TV came in, they were all for it because they were the ones getting paid. Well, ABC was so desperate for programming that they were getting the dregs. They were getting the leftovers. The ones that the other guys rejected is what they got. And, for better or worse, they were good judges of talent, those other two guys. And they rejected things for a reason, not for a political reason, but because they didn't think they had the natural affinity for it. Doesn't mean things didn't break out anyway. But ABC came to the one guy who was a little bit of a maverick and who had this idea and said, you know what? If you'll make a deal with us to put a couple of shows on our network, we'll lend you the money to open this thing you want to build down there in the Orange Groves. And so $17 million later, or 19, I forget what it was, but less than $20 million, Walt got Disneyland. But Walt, being a savvy guy, said, well, if I'm going to do shows for these people, those shows are going to wind up being basically commercials for this thing I'm building in the Orange Groves. And so the two shows were the Mickey Mouse Club, which was get people involved in my kids' stuff right away, and the Disneyland show, which later became the Wonderful World of Disney and the Wonderful World of Color and all those wonderful worlds. And every week, as you know very well, Vash, on that show, and now we go for a construction report to Disneyland. And that meant that for a year before it opened or more, commercials were basically being beamed in the guise of television to every home in America, so that not just the kids in Orange County and LA wanted to go, everybody wanted to go. Mommy, can we go to Disneyland? Well, even the show was divided by the names of the lands. Adventureland this week, and that was all what they called true life adventures, the documentaries about Africa and about animals. Fantasyland, obviously, was the classic cartoon characters. Tomorrowland was about the future and about science and rocket ships and things. And there was no Norland Square, so there wasn't a whole week on beignet, but or Tiana's mud. But well, that's the origin of it. So that's how it happened.
And it was a great bet, too, from ABC, because I think that opening day broadcast garnered anywhere between 70 to 90 million people watching it across the country. I mean, it was
at a time when the population was much less than it is now. And not every house in America had a television set. We forget about that. So it paid off for everybody involved. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And
it is safe to say that had that deal not happened, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about all these Disney theme parks. I mean, something would have come along, but not. Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Wall.
The genesis of this stuff is largely, it's from TV. It's from those chances that both Walt took and that studios or
Leonard Goldenson,
the finance
the head
guys
of ABC, also took a big chance. But
you're right.
Because, it may be one thing, well, it's only a big TV network. There's only 17, 18. That was a lot of money then, and they were the ones that were poorest. They didn't have it. Which meant they didn't have the advertising revenues that ABC or NBC and CBS had. So
Right.
there you go.
Oh, man. And there's great stories of Roy trying to get, the financing and everything like that. And it's definitely a thing.
And bringing in all the sponsors, of course, is part of that, too. I don't know if people realize that Disneyland once had the Upjohn Pharmacy chain, which basically the exhibit at Disneyland was, if you remember old pharmacies, those big, weird glass bottles full of strange colored liquids that had nothing to do, but they were just how pharmacies build themselves. And the Monsanto Hall of Chemicals and Pendleton Mills clothing in Frontierland, where I bought a lot of clothes over the years because they actually had large sizes, unlike the stores. Great stuff. I still have black knit ties and a burgundy knit tie that I got at Pendleton. So those were the days.
Sunkissed,
Wurlitzer, yes. Sunkissed orange juice, yeah. Welch's grape juice.
Right. Carnation.
That was my go-to place in Fantasyland. And they had it illustrated with Bacchus and the nymphs from Fantasia. And they had, on a hot day at Disneyland, forget about the Coke and the Pepsi and all that. They had ice-cold white grape juice from Welch's, the most wonderful, refreshing elixir of life on a hot, sweaty day in Orange County, I got to tell you. But I don't even know if they make that anymore, but I guess they do. But anyway, all of that was because he needed the money. And, of course, that concept fed forward into Epcot and into the World's Fair with Ford and with Pepsi on behalf of UNESCO doing Small World. Right. And the state of Illinois doing Abraham Lincoln, who was born in Kentucky, wasn't he? Anyway.
Well, yeah, I think he was. And then he made his way over to Illinois, interestingly enough. Yeah, UNICEF and PepsiCo doing Small World and Ford and all kinds of stuff. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Wizard of Bras on Main Street as well.
Oh, yes, the Wizard of Bras. By all means, did you all out there know there was a bra store at Disneyland? Well, there was.
Yeah, you're seeing the picture of it right now, folks. I'm sure, because I can't help myself. But thank you so much, Lou. We're gonna have to
pay no attention to that lingerie behind the curtain, the Wizard of Bras.
Yes, exactly. We're gonna have to do a Disneyland special or something like that. And interaction between Hollywood and everything. I think that'd be really, really fun, spectacular stuff.
And of course, you have to remember they couldn't have gotten those sponsors without that ABC deal, because the ABC deal ensured that what if you gave a sponsorship and nobody showed up? What if you gave a sponsorship in a place that the whole country wasn't so aware of for the previous year, watching it be built? All of this stuff connects, folks. There's a synergy here. And some of the failures we're seeing today of various things from various people are because they think, well, we can stand alone and not have to deal with all that riffraff. Oh, yeah? Okay. You try it your way. It worked in the past. As we said, it's coming back to the past as far as TV is concerned.
I would very much agree. I'd also like to do, in reference to the last question right there, the change from the Cineplex to the Multiplex. I think that'd be kind of cool. Definitely plenty of stuff to talk about for sure. And hey, your questions are part of the show. Make sure you go ahead and leave those in the comments or at t3ponline@yahoo.com right there to make sure that your question is answered. You can go ahead and see the link right there below. But thank you, Lou. I think this was a great show. Fascinating stuff, and I think our viewers are going to get quite the kick out of it. That is for sure.
Well, we certainly covered a lot of ground. We usually do that, and that's always what's fascinating to me because, folks, I don't hear these questions before you do. I just wing it. There's something to be said for spontaneous combustion or whatever we want to call it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, guys. Hey, if you like this video, If you really like this video, go ahead and share this video out. Make sure you leave a comment below, and we'll see you all next time. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Please comment, like, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to That Park Place Podcasts Online, your source for exclusive content and highlights from WDW Pro, The Pro Show, and That Park Place for all the news that should be fun.